Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Scrutiny Overview Committee of the Tuesday, the 13th of December. I've just got to do some housekeeping first before we get into the main agenda items. Just to remind those about mobile phones, not to use them in the meeting. Please, for those that have pack page numbers on their reports, which are in your bottom right-hand corner, please can you refer to that specific page using the pack number rather than the report number. Finally, we are webcasting this meeting, so this meeting is being filmed for live and subsequent broadcast via the Council internet site. Generally, the public seating areas are not filmed. The webcasting systems, for all of you, to remind you, uses a signal from the microphone, so members and officers are reminded to please use the microphone provided to ensure your contribution is recorded. Please also turn the microphone off again when you finish speaking. And there was a second, finally, just a reminder that this committee is going paperless. So tonight is the last time we will have hard copies circulated to everyone. There will, at the next meeting, everything will be sent electronically and only a few hard copies will be available. And so by March, will be electronically only and saving the taxpayer more money every time. Okay, so just to remind you as well that if a fire alarm sounds, you are asked to leave the meeting by the nearest available exit. So, item 1, apologies for absence.
There are none.
Item 2, minutes of the last meeting. So the last meeting was held on Tuesday the 1st of November and can be found at pack page 1 of the agenda. Are there any items to correct? All correct? Agreed? Item 3, disclosure of interest. The committee needs only disclose any interests that do not appear on their annual register of interest. If required at any point during the meeting, forms can be obtained from the Members' Services Manager. Item 4, urgent business. There isn't any urgent business, but there are a number of items of additional papers that have been given out to councillors, and you can find them on the appropriate page on the Council website. Item 5 is exempt items to confirm the allocation of business between Part A and B of the agenda. Currently, there is none identified, and we would move them unless there's a resolution if that needed to be done. So that brings us up onto the first substantial item of the evening, which is the question time with the Leader of the Council. Just remind everyone that the portfolio for the Council Leader can be found at pack page 11. So welcome, Leader of the Council, Councillor Tony Newman, and Joe Negrini, the Chief Exec.
Hello, good evening, welcome and thank you very much, Chair. Would you like me to go straight into a presentation? Okay, I'm told if I press this it'll happen, but it hasn't. There we go. And if we press that, it's meant to carry on, so...
Stephen?
Sorry?
Stephen? Make sure.
I think if you press like that. Great. Oh, yes it is.
Well, I'm not sure if I can hold it up like that for the entire evening, but we'll give that a go. No, if you just move them along, just look for a little. We're going to go quickly. We're going to go quickly through this. Okay, so look, I think the point that I would want to make here is that we have positioned Croydon as London's growth borough. We're working in a partnership with many people across London, and it's very much how we're placing Croydon, I think, within terms of London. So we had those extraordinary growth figures, and well-deserved back in the summer, the huge growth in the tech sector, and you've seen, and much discussed here, I think, the improvements in our schools. But if we can rapidly move along, so we're going to go through a lot here. This is about setting a strong leadership for the borough, both at member and officer level, and making sure that, as we've seen in recent tragic events, that the robust systems this council has in place, hopefully the leadership we have in place across the organisation, both can position ourselves well for the challenges that we know we're going to face and those that we don't. As I touched on the partnership, this is absolutely fundamental. The work we've done with the Treasury of the current government, the GLA and Mayor of London, both Boris and Sadiq. I have said it in this chamber about how it took a Labour leader to go and work with the Conservative Mayor in London, but that is very much the view of the then Conservative Mayor. Central government, this is about, when it really matters, taking the party politics out of it, and Croydon working very much for Croydon. Moving on. So there's some absolutely, any one of those issues we could spend a lot of time discussing, but the partnership as well beyond London, so that one at the bottom there, Coast to Capital, the work we're doing with the board there. So this is Croydon into London, and Croydon working with Crawley, Brighton and others down to the south coast. We've said culture's at the heart of the regeneration in the borough, and that's very real with what we're doing. And the whole issues around that very much people are dealing with today, the appalling catastrophe, frankly, that is Southern Rail. But we see how important it is that we have those vital rail links running well for this borough, and issues like the second runway, which we'll continue to lobby on and work closely with Gatwick. Moving on, it is happening, I think, is the message. Moving on. There, that was Sadiq. That's extraordinary to think. What's extraordinary about that? That's Box Park, only in September. We thought it would be impressive, but little did we know how impressive it was going to be. It was still a building site. Brick by Brick is the company's much talked about, the most transparent local authority company in the land, going to be delivering affordable housing across the borough on the council's the land the council actually owns, which is the key thing, which means there's an awful lot of stuff about to come through planning, and then we'll be delivering out there the affordable homes for local people that we talked about a lot. The growth zone, that is a very obvious shot of what it encompasses, and the growth zone will be made real when we have the retention of the business rates from Westfield on site, but that is a unique deal. There is Box Park, just gone drifting through there. If you missed me on stage last week, I'm told the video is available. The Fairfield Halls, this again is a huge commitment by the council, if you like. This is our major commitment in terms of that part of town. £30 million of investment. There's people working on it. I could see from my office window this evening. That's very much a work in progress to make sure that we have a cultural theatre, concert hall and space fit for the next 50 years as well. And that's a key piece of delivery, and very much on track. Westfield has slipped, and we need to see that planning application, which is coming through the planning process early in the new year. So I welcome that. Welcome the new homes that are part of the scheme now, and look forward to literally the first piece of work going on site as soon as possible, because I think that modern retail offer for the town, it's as important today to see that coming through as it was when it was first announced 5 years ago. The living wage, we've made a very strong commitment as an administration that we want to see the people of Croydon benefit from the growth that is coming to our town and very much starting to be delivered. And that was a statement, I think it was the first cabinet paper on the first agenda of our first cabinet, that if you're working with and for this council, you will pay the London living wage. A lot of work gone into it to spread that wider. The Go on Digital, we had that at Cabinet last night. Amazing statistics and stories there about how more and more people are going online in the borough. And that's part of an inclusive borough, because behind the exciting sort of digital world is an equalities and inclusiveness agenda and a breaking down of issues like social isolation that our Fairness Commission identified. So we will continue to crack on with that work. Boundary Commission, very important to make sure that everyone has a voice that's fairly heard across the borough. That's why we invited the Boundary Commission in, and I know they're very interested in what we're doing around devolution, but we'll now await the Boundary Commission's words of wisdom in the new year, but that's a process that's very much live at the moment. Facilities management, this is a very good example, I think, of how, as Councillor Hall will talk about later, we're in the process of finding £80 million of efficiency savings. This is part that's been delivered, where we brought an operation back in-house, improved the service and saving money. There could be others up there, such as SEN Transport, but that's a very real process that's been delivered. As we have, this one's very important indeed. It was a controversial project under the previous administration, the new council building. But as an administration, that's what we inherited. But we've been very keen indeed to make sure that we sweat that asset and deliver better value for money for the taxpayers of Croydon from what was a hugely expensive project. So I'm delighted that we've been able to let out the first 2 floors, and that's devolving an income and a saving, if you like, to the taxpayers of Croydon, and making that project better value. Another example of how we're driving value for money and innovation as we change the sort of processes of how things are done in the borough. School standards, as I've already touched on, delighted to see that they're outperforming the national average in Croydon. And I think we're turning around what's been a very difficult story for this borough going years ago. But no complacency at all, and we'll continue as a council to play our role to ensure those standards continue to be driven up. The 360 school places in the last 12 months. Huge programme of delivery. I acknowledge that some of that work was started under the previous administration as well. It's very important. It shouldn't be a party political issue in this town. Making sure every child has the opportunity for a brilliant education should be something we all want to see right across Croydon. Again, as the Cabinet meeting reported back on last night, another, I think, extraordinary performance by all involved, because this service is doing very much more with less. It's been at the forefront of some government cuts, yet we've still seen that service, even with a reduced budget, come out with a very strong and positive good Ofsted. This is in the Woodside ward, Love Lane, Place Street. Great to see that made real, and fantastic achievement, but something I would recommend more streets in Croydon do. Best Start, again, a real commitment by the council to changing how we intervene and work with people at the earliest possible age, as the name tends to suggest. On-site youth zone, that's another massive project coming to this town, be on site next year, where we'll see literally the provision of a massive youth project involving hundreds and hundreds of young people in this borough. For anyone that's not been up to see the existing youth zones in places like Wigan, I'd recommend it. I think it's 400 or 500 children a night. Some nights are using the youth zone up there. And everyone pays 50p an evening as part of the commitment to it. The young people of Croydon have come up with their own name, Legacy, and we will be working closely with Onside to deliver that. Another example there of the council having to respond rapidly to a national crisis in terms of the Calais children and the recent taking down of the camp over in France, and I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the officers who worked, through the night and over many weekends recently to make sure that Croydon played absolutely our role in hosting that major operation that was a national operation, and it still continues to this day. Transforming adult social care. Something I'm sure we might discuss later in this committee. This is something that this borough is proud to be leading on in terms of many innovative ways of working. But this is a national crisis. It's making the national news this week. It is chronically underfunded. That politicians in local government cross-party agree with that, and I think we need to see the government very much coming up with some long-term solutions and planning, and not just relying on local councils in terms of local taxation to important as though that money is to put essentially a sticking plaster over a much bigger issue. The commissioning consortium we have across South London is another very strong example of how we're delivering services differently, working in a partnership with others across South London, as we are in many other areas. The investment in culture is real, not just in terms of the new work at places like Fairfield, but the Museum of Croydon, really bringing that back into popular use and really driving up the numbers visiting that. Libraries, likewise, this administration's given a very clear commitment around our priorities around libraries, and there's improvements there. I think the children's library is being relaunched again, looking well and truly spruced up this coming weekend. Just be another partnership with what we're doing with health and public health, and more innovation, I think, in terms of how the council's working. The tech offer, and again, we visited this site recently with the Mayor of London. A very good example of the council working in partnership with others, former council building, private sector involvement, money from the GLA, money from the council, and very much supporting start-up businesses in the town, as well as a great destination if you've not tried it for lunch. The Pearl Azuma cycle race, I think this is a very strong statement around how we want to continue to hold a major national event in this town. It's had a huge support, and prove the cynics, of which there's always one or two, totally wrong in terms of the support it's had and the message it sent out about Croydon and the national media coverage we've had from that event. Imperial Way, the council intervening here to take very tough action indeed. Very dangerous what was happening there, and very pleased to see that we're being successful with that, but we need to remain very focused on that one. 20 miles an hour, again at Cabinet last night, but the strategic view of how we are delivering the manifesto promises. We had an ambitious for Croydon manifesto, and I hope what you're seeing through these slides, they're not a series of random events, they're a series of commitments we made, both in terms of partnership working, delivering 20 miles an hour zones, working in partnership with others, working with City Hall, working with national government to improve Croydon. Jobs brokerage scheme as well, making sure that the council's proactively working with people out there to ensure, as I said earlier, that local people are maximising their opportunity to benefit from the opportunities that the incoming growth into the borough is providing. Celebrating culture, as Councillor Collins would be very keen for me to point out, not just the current cultural revolution in Croydon, but culture, our past as well. And we should absolutely celebrate the past, but not live in the past. We hopefully are building a cultural offer to celebrate in the future as well in Croydon. And there are risks. There's a lot of exciting opportunities, as hopefully that gives a hint of, and things actually being delivered and happening in this borough now. But Brexit has undoubtedly unnerved some in the business community. We're seeing ongoing changes in terms of housing, some of it to be welcomed. I won't go over the southern issue again, but clearly that just illustrates the potential threats there. You know, companies that have moved to the borough, everything going well, then the southern things exploded, if you like, and that is causing the residents of this borough ongoing grief. Increase in population brings its own challenges, and we're responding to that with the housing agenda, but it does put extra pressure on our public services at a time when we're getting less money from government. You know, we should remember that we have had 40% less funding in recent years. That's why we're driving those efficiency savings. We've achieved that by keeping the charge for council tax at or below the rate of inflation for local services, and we're determined to keep doing that. But we've seen the piece around adult social care, and we'll be awaiting announcements from government on that. But it's because we took the tough decisions very early on as administration that we couldn't continue salami slicing the services in this town, and we had to do things differently, whether that's digitally, through the regeneration, working in partnership with the GLA government or whatever. We had to change the way the town was being run in terms of those services being delivered. You know, and I think the previous administration had cut, if you like, as much as you could in terms of salami slicing the existing services, and this is about how you do things differently. And opportunities, clearly, as I hope I've set out, making sure that we continue to drive that growth, and Croydon as the key driver of the economy in South London. Very much welcome the Mayor recognising it, both mayors we've had this year recognising it as the capital of South London. Partnership with others, looking, I think, at how we do things differently in the NHS future as well. We don't accept that the SDP model that we've seen from the NHS is necessarily the best one for Croydon, and continuing to work closely with our communities right across the borough. That, Chair, is probably a good place to pause for now, but I hope that sets out how Croydon is changing rapidly, has its challenges. Change brings challenges, but we are bringing huge investment into London's growth borough and ensuring that local people benefit from that investment.
Thank you, Leader, for that comprehensive overview. Obviously, people have got seen some of the copies of the presentation before. So the way I'm going to deal with this item is ask councillors to ask a series of questions. So can you just indicate who would like to go first? You get to go last. Joy, you will be called.
Thank you very much, Leader. I don't know if these questions will necessarily be joined up or a bit random, but I'm sure you can cope either way. What worries me slightly, more than slightly actually, is the impending disruption of all these good things coming at once. The delay in the Westfield, in the redevelopment of the town centre, the overlap in timing with the Fairfield Hall on the cultural side, and our dependence on these and similar things for the growth. I'm concerned that there might be a dip within the next few years, and I'm concerned that trade, once lost, will never come back. So, you know, any sort of plans you have around that area, I'd be really pleased to hear about. And secondly, I'll leave it just at two for now. Similar threat, Southern is, you know, capable of sort of taking the heart out of Croydon if it doesn't improve. Are there any sort of thoughts, contingency plans for other kinds of transport to lessen our dependence on Southern? Or I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think in terms of let's take Southern first. I think the honest answer is that there are always other forms of transport, and we've seen people trying some of them today. But it's absolutely fundamental that Southern is sorted out rapidly, because even if that was to happen tomorrow, that still takes us back to the need to see infrastructure improvements at the station, extended platforms, you know, a modern station. I mean, part of the challenge of a borough that is growing, and even before some of the more recent growth, you know, East Croydon Station needs dramatic improvement. The station nearest to where I live and the ward I represent, Norwood Junction, needs ongoing improvement, and it's utterly unacceptable. It doesn't have disabled access, and we want to see TfL delivering things like the Dingwall Loop to make the tram system work well. Rapidly. In terms of the planning, I suppose there's always an upside. There's been more time for officials, and I know officers, TfL and the GLA are working very closely together on the planning for when Westfield's on site, and in a sense, not through anything to do with the council, but there's more time in terms of to make sure that huge piece of work that you allude to there is done properly. But in terms of the work that's going on in the town centre, I'm very encouraged with what happened with the bid, the vote of confidence they had in themselves recently from the businesses, the move across of many of the businesses to Suntrail, to make sure that we have a vibrant town centre as the ongoing work will begin vis-à-vis Westfield. I think the Fairfield is where I would slightly disagree, is a positive, because that work's underway. The council has much greater direct control over that, that's very much on course. And just seeing the recent success of Box Park up there, I mean, I was, I would hope. We would see within a couple of years, it won't be either or. People might go to see a show at Fairfield and have a drink at Box Park, or the other way around, whatever. But we want to see that area rapidly continuing to expand. I think in terms of the longer term piece, we mustn't be complacent, but it's why we continue to absolutely drive growth to Superdrug, Body Shop, Inland Revenue with thousands of jobs. These are huge organisations moving their HQs and their companies and their staff into the borough, and that is a massive vote of confidence in what's happening in the town. But as we, I think we'll probably repeatedly identify tonight, that the immediate threat of Southern is very real indeed, and every time I've got a microphone in front of me, all I can do is urge the government to take a strategic view of it and stop this, ridiculous battle. I mean, the Mayor of London's made it very clear indeed he's prepared to take it over. I know that privately most Conservatives, certainly in London, whether they're members of Parliament or GLA members, share that view. But everyone's in a very difficult situation because the Transport Minister seems to have taken a completely different view.
Kathy?
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of kind of slightly different questions, and actually, but staying on the same theme in the way that Joy was talking about risks. There are quite a few risks that you set up there, and we spent quite a long time in GPAC recently discussing risks. What are the 3 risks that, for you, are the most significant for Croydon and have the greatest potential to keep you awake at night? That's the first question. On a completely different subject, you showed a couple of slides about how good the school results have been recently, and what, in your view, have been the key factors that have led to those improvements.
I would. I think in terms of risks, if we're going to be honest, Brexit is an ongoing risk. Whatever people's views on it, whether people were remain or stay. When you talk to businesses, and everybody I think around this table is aware of it, people running businesses and perhaps people running councils, but certainly people running businesses don't like uncertainty. They don't like ongoing long-term uncertainty, and it's clear now there's a whole variety of views within the government of the country, let alone the opposition and anybody else. So the ongoing uncertainty around Brexit is a risk to the economy. I think Croydon's probably as well placed as anybody to be able to be resilient to that risk because of our positioning within London. But that uncertainty has to be a risk. I am going to say it again because I think it is a serious risk. I think Southern are a risk that has to be addressed, not just in terms of the resolution of this immediate dispute, but in terms of removing them from the equation going forward, one way or the other. They are damaging this town. I mean, they are damaging towns right from here down to Eastbourne, Chichester, and and it's MPs of not the Labour Party who are equally exercised by what's happening to their residents and workers in those places, and probably the ongoing long-term risk to local government collectively is if we don't see, and I don't think we're going to see it this Thursday, I fear, as I said, we're going to see a more of a sticking plaster, but if we don't see a long-term policy commitment, and this is, both governments haven't, if we're going to be honest, particularly delivered on this in the last 10 or 15 years. If we don't see a long-term commitment from national government in England to have a national solution to adult social care and the ongoing pressures there, and where we know the population's going in terms of an ageing population, then that has to be a risk, because we've all seen those graphs that show, local government would end up, in theory, doing nothing else other than funding adult social care. And so that's not an acceptable position, and that has to be a risk for this council and most councils of any significant size up and down the country. You did ask another question. It's schools. So, as I said earlier, I think a commitment to a recognition perhaps it could have been earlier, but a recognition that we needed to build new schools and drive a school places agenda in this borough has been a positive to place us as well as we can be for the ongoing demand. I think a good partnership working with the council, with the schools, has helped. I know there are some schools where it's works very well indeed, and others where it's more of a challenge. But I think we have enough people literally in the room at enough times talking about the education and the ongoing pressures in the borough that there is real partnership work in there that's paying off. But I think we have to redouble our efforts on the schools issue, because it will be an ongoing pressure, but it's not just about the numbers. I know you know this. It's also making sure, as we're seeing, that the quality of education continues to be driven upwards.
Carol?
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned both Coast Capital and Gatwick in your presentation. Just putting Southern to one side for the moment, because obviously that's very relevant to both those things. What scope do you think there is for expansion at Gatwick, despite the decision that the government appears to have made, at least, although we've not had a final decision, I think?
Well, I mean, Gatwick tell us and others that they intend to continue to expand. As somebody that's now looked at this far closer than perhaps I thought I might have done a year ago, it's very clear indeed that their model offers a very practical solution in terms of that second runway, and it's equally clear, I think, that Heathrow is, if it was ever going to happen, is many years away. So I think working closely as we are doing in partnership with Gatwick in terms of the local jobs that will continue to generate for people in Croydon is something we need to do. But I think working with Gatwick and others to continue to make the case that in terms of a practical solution that could deliver a new runway for London within the next decade rather than 20 or 30 years in some sort of fantasy land, I think, then I think Gatwick is the practical solution. And I think in time government, whichever government it is, will come to see that. And what I don't understand is why government had to drive it into an either-or. I would have thought they could have said, well, let's have a medium and a longer-term plan, and let Gatwick crack on with it. And if Heathrow then were able to follow through with another runway, such as the projected increase in demand, well, perhaps that could happen as well. So I don't understand why it was turned into an either-or debate.
You also mentioned the facilities management procurement, which generated about £2 million worth of savings. What other contract or re-procurement opportunities do you think there are, in the next few years to generate either similar amounts or substantial amounts of savings?
Well, I'm sure Councillor Simon Hall will touch on that in more detail when he makes a contribution, because I know he's personally reviewing with officers, I think, every contract for everything this council does. But another example that I think I touched on during the presentation there was the SEN, Special Education Needs Transport, where that was an outsourced contract. We've had, I would think it's more than a pilot now, but some of that we brought back in-house. The service has improved. Children are being transported in vehicles that are safer. The staff are being paid the London living wage, and it's costing the taxpayer less, rather than just handing out money to private taxi companies to rip off the taxpayer and leave children in some circumstances in a vulnerable position. So I think that's an area where I'm encouraging officers to work a lot closer. I also think when we look at the longer-term future, there has to be something we can do more around in-house, or certainly in-house and partnership working with things like IT provision, where lots of this council's budget goes. It's a rapidly changing world out there. We were, some of us, down at the Brit School last week looking at what the young people are doing there in terms of designing apps and going off to earn a fortune in Hollywood or wherever they're doing it. Well, if they're designing apps in Croydon in the Brit School, perhaps they can come and design some apps in Croydon Council and work with us in a true partnership involving local people. So I think the future IT is an area for me. What we're doing in partnership around adult social care and the NHS is an opportunity to bring more services perhaps directly in-house, and I've said a couple of immediate ones there, but I know that Councillor Simon Hall is reviewing everything as we speak.
Thank you, Chair. My questions take on a little bit of a different tack from those previously. My first question is around kind of obvious division in Croydon, north to south, Labour Conservative. I guess my question would just be a candid one to you as to whether you feel that this administration has been successful in reaching out to all areas of the borough, both north and south, because reading through the many, many slides which you went through, thank you for that, there's an awful lot of projects which I see which are going on in the centre, which is great, and some in the north, but there's nothing in the south. And I can understand it might be, you know, where the need is, etc. But do you feel like you are reaching out to those areas? I would like to press you a little bit more on the slippage in Westfield as to why that has happened, because it is, again, it's a fantastic thing for Croydon, it's a great opportunity, but we need it to happen and we need it to be delivered sooner rather than later, and I think there is a risk the longer it goes on. So I guess I'd be keen to hear from you a bit more specifically around why it is slipping, what steps are being taken to stop it from slipping, and when we can actually see something tangible being delivered. My third question is on a more kind of micro-granular level. We've obviously seen quite recently with the local plan quite strong sentiments, particularly within the Conservative wards, from residents on issues. Again, it's great to hear about the big projects, it's great to hear about the economy growing, but if you strip that back and look at things on a micro level, so streets being cleaned, bins going, you know, green waste, these are issues that actually people care an awful lot about from a residents' basis in their day-to-day lives. And that's where I feel there is quite a lot of concern, particularly from my residents. Maybe it's in the south, I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but the noise that I hear is that they are concerned about that. And it's interesting with Southern because parking has been a huge problem, traffic jams around Malpit Lane and Stokes Road has been a huge problem recently in the ward, irrespective of trains, and this has just kind of made it 10 times worse. So do you feel that as an administration you're really listening to those needs on a micro level and you're not getting too focused on the big issues because they're glamorous and it's nice to go, you know, and say, oh look, we've achieved Box Park and oh, we're doing this with Westfield and oh, we're doing this with Fairfield Halls, but what are you doing for the things that residents actually care about for their daily lives? And my final question is around national government. Obviously it's crucial that Croydon gets the right funding. And it's great that we've got Gavin now in a stronger position for lobbying for that, and with Chris Philp as well, and obviously Steve Reid for what part he plays. My impression is that it's always the government's fault unless we need something, and that's when we all want to work collaboratively in the interests of Croydon. I guess I'd be keen to hear how practically as an administration we are working with the national government to get the best interests of Croydon, rather than just blaming it, saying, oh, it's the Tory government's fault, it's austerity, it's cuts. I'm a little bit sick of hearing that, to be honest. I haven't heard it quite so much tonight, which is nice, and I hope I don't. But I guess I'd like to just hear from you in regards to how the Council's strategy is going to work with whatever party in national government going forward for the benefits of Croydon. I appreciate I've asked quite a lot there, but thank you.
There was quite a lot there. So you wouldn't expect me to turn up here without a bit of politics. I mean, the fact the Conservative Party at the moment is currently sort of jettisoning on a daily basis every one of David Cameron and George Osborne's policies is interesting, including apparently we now hear austerity, but we'll wait to see if that's really delivered in terms of anything significant coming back to adult social care on Thursday. I mean, I think in fairness to the presentation, I made it very clear quite at the start of that as an administration very early on, we were working with the Treasury of the Conservative government on that growth deal. And that at the time, that was with the GLA and the Treasury. And the GLA was very much being run by Conservative Mayor Boris Johnson, the Treasury and the Council. So I think that was a very strong example of cross-party working. And when we went actually up to present the case at the House of Parliament, it was Steve Reid doing a very excellent job, along with Gavin Barwell, who we led on those presentations with me. And we were very much making the point that it was cross-party. In terms of the presentation, I'm now feeling annoyed that I didn't put a picture of the car park in Purley Inn, where this council's about to spend an awful lot of money. Work started yesterday on renovating a car park that the previous administration had left damp, dark and potentially unsafe for many years. It is this administration, however it's analysed, that secured the medium-term future of the Paul in Purley, and is actively working to make sure we can bring another one for the longer term. It is this administration that worked in partnership with businesses in Croydon, in Purley rather, to put together the Purley bid. And it is this administration that's worked hand in glove, albeit with some disagreements down the way with Chris Philp MP, in terms of issues like car parking and bigger issues in Causden. So we do work right across the borough. In terms of, I thought another very important question, you said what you might call the core services that affect people's lives. Well, making sure the streets are clean, and that's a project that's very much ongoing. We're making progress, but we recognise there's an awful lot further to go there. But, the fly tipping prosecutions, the signals this council sent out that it absolutely is one of our key priorities, and working with 250 reps from the community on that now, street champions, residents' associations across the borough. That work is starting to pay off, but there is a long way to go with that. I recognise that. And I think Councillor Collins will be announcing some serious investments in some more equipment to help us tackle that early in the new year. What we're doing, working with the NHS to ensure that has a sustainable future in Croydon, and the work in terms of the reality behind what you call the glamour of the growth zone is jobs for local people, creating local jobs. And not just saying at any price, we want quality jobs, quality training, quality companies moving into Croydon. And I think if in terms of a good education, jobs, clean and safe streets and the health service, I would very much argue they are the issues that for most families in Croydon, keeping the council tax at affordable levels, that they would look for this council to be doing. And some of the big projects, like Brick by Brick, when you strip them down, they're actually about many smaller projects right across the borough, and that's the reality of that, that providing houses in terms of local people. In terms of Westfield, look, Westfield is Westfield. It's not a council project. It's not run by the council. It's a private sector company from Australia that Gavin Barwell brought into Croydon, put on his election material last year, and said he was personally delivering Westfield for the people of Croydon. So I continue to work very closely with the GLA, with Gavin and others, because we all want to see Westfield on site, cracking on and adding more jobs to to what they're doing. But but you know, there are commercial reasons. They have their own board to satisfy, and there is a plan in process. But I think you'll find in any independent analysis from the GLA under both administrations will show that it's certainly the council, in terms of what we're doing as a planning partner in that process, could not have done more. And when we have those meetings at the GLA, both with Eddie Lister and Boris Johnson, and with Sadiq and Jules Pipe in the new team, you know, we've had all the three MPs with us from Croydon, as well as myself and Councillor Butler, and officials from the GLA, Westfield and others. So everybody is literally in the same room having those conversations. But the council, and I ask the questions, and I'm satisfied that in terms of the work our planners are doing, they could not be doing more to facilitate that, and we're ready to go as soon as Westfield are ready to press the final green button.
Thank you, Chair. Just one final thing I would just like to come back on is around the issue of the local plan. Given the sheer volume of responses, and I know at last council there was a bit of ambiguity around just how many responses there had been received from each area, I can appreciate that there's always an element of NIMBYism in anything of what you do, that residents are naturally going to feel resistant towards things. Do you personally, honestly feel that you have fully listened to all of those residents and engaged with them in the right way? Because just based upon the strength of feeling by some, from a neutral standpoint, can you at least concede that there is room for improvement there in terms of the feelings amongst certain communities in areas like Shirley and Purley, which aren't obviously your traditional vote-winning ground, shall we say, but where there is still a need to represent the views of those residents? What can you do to reach out to those communities and make sure that they feel their voices are being listened to?
Well, I think whatever the dispute of the numbers, nobody disagrees it's been thousands of responses. I know that my colleague Councillor Butler has gone to quite extraordinary lengths in terms of conversations, meetings, exchanges over letters, emails, whatever, in terms of that conversation. And there is a sense of people, and I understand that, not always welcoming change. But I think I'm right in saying, if you look on the Save Shirley website, it talks about we don't want any developments over 4 stories. Well, that is something that many people across Croydon, I mean, the discussion in Purley, I think it's been over 17 stories. I think if you are metaphorically and literally setting the bar that low, it does provide a challenge, because I genuinely think that if you look at the original plans and where they are now, there has been change, and that clearly reflects that people have been listened to. And I suppose from my side of that discussion, I've watched Councillor Butler and how she's responded and listened and has changed, and then to still see, it's a tiny handful of people now, but to still see a tiny handful of people acting as though there's been no dialogue, no conversation and no response, does sadden me a bit. But I recognise, as I said, that change brings challenges, and we all probably need to do more to explain why we do need to see new homes in Croydon, to make sure the sons and daughters of residents already here, as a starting point, can afford to stay in this town if that's what they wish. And the only way that can be achieved in the long term is to have a fair share of new homes spread across the borough. And I know that's what colleagues are trying to achieve, but I accept it does bring challenges.
Thank you, Chair. I have 2 questions, really, 2 areas. The first one is the Westfield and Hammerson. I wondered if you could indicate to us what the timescale is now, because it has changed. I think it's moved a few times. And also, residents are all the time saying, are we going to get John Lewis here? And so, I mean, obviously, some of these things might well be confidential, but these are general areas. You must have some general idea of how the negotiations have been going, because we knew when we were in control, how close we were at certain things. So at certain points. So could you give a bit more detail on that, please, particularly on the timescale? And then the second area I want you to give us a bit of information on is the brick by brick project. Residents are not clear, really, how much power it has. I mean, is it a gateway to housing? You just gave that in one of your answers earlier, actually, that housing was going to be put forward by them. But does that mean they're actually going to be then building them, or is it just a gateway in order to contact other people for the building? Could you just give us a bit more detail on that, please?
Well, I mean, look, on Westfield Hammerson, they have their negotiations with John Lewis and others, and my understanding is they're ongoing. But I think, as you alluded to, they were ongoing when you were the administration, and that's going back 2.5 years. And you know, as I said, Westfield arrived in this town sort of brought in on a chariot, if you like, by Gavin and Boris, and you know. Both administrations have, I'm convinced, worked, hard with them in terms of the planning process. But at the end of the day, they're an Australian company, they're a global company, and they have to take their decisions on that basis. And they have been renegotiating in terms of the change in the retail offer. So there's a lot more housing in what they're proposing now than there was in the original scheme that they were probably talking to us and you about when you were the administration, and so there's a lot to be welcomed in that. But obviously, by going back and re-presenting a second scheme, Westfield have delayed their original proposals. But perhaps it will make a good scrutiny session to invite Westfield in at some point to make sure that they're ticking all the boxes in terms of the members of scrutiny, in terms of questions that you have, because I'm not here as a spokesman for Westfield. They're another business looking to do business in this town. In terms of brick by brick, I mean, this has been the most. In fact, I think you've had brick by brick act scrutiny, haven't you? So presumably you've been able to ask all those questions. But brick by brick is very much a serious partnership with the local authority. It is working with high quality architects and builders. It is using the council's land, and it is to develop a whole raft of homes, of which at least 50% will be affordable for local people across the town. And I don't think there's anything more I can add to brick by brick than this committee, the council, the cabinet has already had. But I know your officers would happily give any member of the opposition, well, in fact, either side of the chamber, further detailed briefing if required. But there's nothing I can add to what's already been said here about brick by brick, other than commend it to the committee chair.
Jason.
Thank you, Chair. Given the number of years I've spent on this committee, I will do my very best to try and keep this non-political, which I know Sean will be very pleased about. There was an awful lot in your opening presentation that I had to completely agree with. The stresses that the Council is under, particularly its overall funding, the challenges of adult social care. I think Gatwick should be expanded. I'm in favour of both being expanded personally, but I agree with you completely. Gatwick was, that's a major opportunity. And the problems with Southern, I agree with you completely. They need sorting, and sorting permanently. I think it's also worth just mentioning the tragedy with the tram. I have to say that I felt the Council dealt with that in an exemplary fashion and couldn't have done any more or any better than it did. I have to sort of praise you for your leadership in that circumstance. You wouldn't have to want to be dealing with it, but you dealt with it as well as it was possible to do so. With regard to questions, I won't go back to Westfield. I think that's been asked enough. I have a sort of a strategic question with regard to the future of school standards. We've seen increasing school standards for a number of years in the borough under both administrations, which is very pleasing. It's something we want to see. But if I could sort of highlight from my own personal experience, both of my children are educated out of borough. I would prefer that they were educated here. I would want them to have shorter journeys, but I did what most parents do, and my children went to the best possible school that I could send them to, regardless of any borough boundary. I know similar choices have been made by members of the Labour Cabinet. But there must come a point where can we continue to improve education in Croydon to the point where people don't send their children out into Sutton and Bromley due to the additional choices of school types that are available? Can we continue to keep pushing so that everyone in Croydon can send their children to a school that meets their needs without having to cross those boundaries? And if so, how are we going to be able to do that? And one very small comment, I won't make it too political, but you listed a general election as a risk. Given recent rhetoric, I would have thought you would have thought that was an opportunity.
Can I start by welcoming what you said about the tram, and I would want to pay tribute to everybody from the council, and as I have done, the voluntary sector, the emergency services, and politicians across this town from all parties who have been incredibly supportive in that. As it, later this week we are again with the families doing a piece around the permanent memorial sites, and that's very important. And that work will go on, even though perhaps now quite rightly out of the spotlight. But I do welcome what you said there, and how that's been supported right across the council and the town beyond that. And equally welcome what you say on Gatwick. I mean, I think that is an ongoing battle that again crosses party political divides, and we should be making the case on behalf of this part of London and certainly Croydon, and the environmental issue as well. I mean, I know there's an issue that planes, wherever they land, bring some pollution with them, but flying them into Gatwick is a better proposition than over the city. In terms of education, if we could take for this evening at least the grammar school debate out of it, then I think how we again work as a borough and a town, regardless of party, to make sure every school it continues to drive an improvement in standards, so that people don't think, and I accept. If you look back historically at some of the challenges, not just in Croydon but elsewhere, how people will make a choice to educate children outside the borough boundary. But I think what we want to do in the future, and there's some progress to that, is to make that a much harder choice for people by actually making the real offer to be inside Croydon. I mean, I think London, compared to the rest of the country, going back to, I think, the London challenge of 10, 12 years ago, London has transformed the state education offer compared to many other places in the country, and collectively London should be proud of that. We're now seeing some welcome progress in Croydon, but it is a challenge because we've got different providers, and some of them want to work in very close partnership, others less so in terms of working with the council. But I think that the goal should absolutely be, and I know it sounds like a sort of a politician soundbite, but if we can make every school excellent, then the choice should be that people want to be educated in Croydon. But we're going in the right direction, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. I agree completely with the aspiration. I guess what I'm sort of getting at is that with the best will in the world, I'm not aware of anywhere where a setup of education such as we currently have in Croydon has been able to counter the lure of grammar schools, and we have them surrounding us in, we're a densely populated area. It's not that far greater distance to be able to get to those schools, and we are seeing a significant number of our brightest pupils leaving the borough and, not appearing on the statistics for Croydon when they could be. I don't want to get into should we have grammar schools or not, but is there any thought being given to, as standards increase, how to get that final level so you can achieve what you've said is an aspiration, but I would see as a very difficult thing to get to without a clear plan?
Well, yeah, I suppose I'm a bit more optimistic in terms of the direction of travel, but I think it is actually, you know, you can have all the strategic plans in the world, but it is breaking it down and working at times, not just the council, you know, business community and others, working in partnership with the schools, both those that still need further improvement, but those that are good to transform them to being excellent. And I think part of it is turning around that reputation. I mean, I know that you speak to a lot of people in the rapidly improving schools in Croydon, and there's still some frustration with people involved in education that there is a perception beyond Croydon of perhaps a Croydon of the past. And so I think it's not just about sort of spinning a positive message, because it's clearly got to be backed up in this area more than most by results. But I think just to have it absolutely as a key priority for the council and our role in it. I think hopefully commitments to building new colleges and increasing the potential for university offer in this town as well. That should send a strong message that education is an absolute priority. The piece around quality jobs and making sure we got people trained for the jobs that are coming to Croydon and we hope to bring to Croydon. Setting an agenda, if you like, where education and ongoing education is absolutely always at the top of the council's priorities, should be what we're seeking to do. But I absolutely accept there is a way to go.
Thank you, Leader. Grammar schools sounds like a subject for us to have a look at, because I've yet to read a piece of evidence that show that they actually benefit the way the councillor suggests. All the evidence points that they have a detrimental effect on the poorer children, because it's a way for middle-class parents to circumvent the system to get the best teachers. And it's basically also it's a slap in the face to all those head teachers of all those other schools who get who end up with a poor result. You've just got to look at the education results in places like Kent to realise what it does to schools that are non-grammar schools, and it would be a detrimental place. But I think it'd be worth having a look at it, because I think one of the problems that we have with the debate is that it's all about parental choice, when actually really it's about designing an education system for all of us, for all children, not just for a select few. So it may be something for us to look at the work programme. London living wage. The council is very proud that when it's letting contracts that we pay the London living wage. I raised in Cabinet yesterday about the disgraceful actions of Ida Verdi, who's taken over Quadron. Sadly, it seems, with the support of the previous administration, which let the contract to Quadron, which basically said that they would sack the park ranger service and replace them with mobile cleaners. Those park rangers have been sent letters, and so instead of being paid £11.30 or something an hour, they're now going to be offered £8.50 per hour, with no overtime for weekends or Sundays or late night working. So they're going to receive a substantial less pay packet if they accept those terms. And if they don't accept those terms, they get made redundant. What are we doing about those firms that are much more interested in favouring their pockets? And while most of these are our residents, are being treated abysmally by this multinational company. What is the council doing about it?
Well, on the general point, we made it very clear as administration from day one that we did not want to be working with companies going forward that were not paying the London living wage or rapidly working towards that. And there's been a radical change in this council's procurement policies in terms of who's working with us, in terms of some of the provisions around social care, as I was touching on earlier. The special education needs transport is another example, and there are many others. But as you're also alluding to, Chair, we inherited a lot of frankly dreadful contracts, I think, where the workforce have been sold out. We saw the previous administration halve the wages of people working in the borough's care homes, which to this day is utterly indefensible. And I don't think Councillor Fisher clearly, well, he didn't, did he? He didn't have the terms, conditions or wages of the people working or on contracts working for this council as anything like a priority, and literally sold them out. And that's not what this council's doing, and we certainly won't be signing any of those contracts for people to work for the council or on behalf of the council as contracted employees. In terms of the very specific case, without taking it into an area where we might identify specific individuals, I have asked some very senior officials in the council to look closely at that, because it's not acceptable to me what's happening there to those individuals, and I know that that's a conversation that's with a degree of urgency, I think, that you alluded to, is going on probably as we speak, or to try and find a resolution so that we don't see, despite that being a contract we inherited, people suffering like that. But it's also been made very clear to that particular company that if they want to work in the longer term with this council, or as this council as part of the South London Partnership, then they need to rapidly change how they treat their staff, how they pay their staff. Otherwise, they won't be working with us in the future, subject to advice that we rightly have to take from the lawyers. So hopefully I can't be much clearer than that without naming individuals, but we are looking at it very closely.
Thank you, Leader. I have those for encouraging comments. One of the questions that comes out of that is about contract management. Where do you think we are in terms of our skills at managing contracts?
I think we're on a rapidly improving trajectory, and I'm sure Councillor Simon Hall and Richard may touch on this in more detail when they're doing their piece shortly. But we have introduced a sort of I suppose a values framework around the contracts. It's not just the lowest price and take whatever comes out of it. We want to see staff treated well. We want to see staff retained. We want to work with companies that respect their workforce. And I think the contract management is getting better, but there is a way to go. It's only a little over 5 years ago, I think, that Councillor Fisher and the previous Chief Executive, but one, issued a declaration that this was to be the first fully outsourced council in the land. Now, I think Barnet beat them to it, thank God. But there was a plan that there would be nobody working for this council. I mean, this council has thousands of people working for it. In Barnet, they're now down to 300 who actually work for the council. Everything and everybody else is outsourced. And I do think when people sometimes say, what's the difference in terms of politics and political parties? Well, as a Labour council, but as a Labour Party, we have an entirely different philosophy. And hopefully that's reflected in what we're doing. But we did inherit a council that had been set on a quite radical course to outsource anything and everything if it moved.
For many people, rents have gone up, housing costs are up, travel costs are up. Even if they were looking at house prices, they've increased so much it's 10 times the average wage. The average family only earns £30,000 a year, but actually there's a significant proportion of the population that earns less than 20,000. And there is a cost of living crisis, and partly that's a reflection of the jobs, and as we've just heard, when you've got multinational companies driving down wages by 20–30%, it has a detrimental impact on, personally, on delivery of service. What's your vision? Because currently we've lost many high-paid jobs from Croydon over the years, like Nestle and a lot of the insurance and some of the computer companies that were here. And Westfield is great, but and there may be opportunities for people within those ones to have career progressions, but in terms of wages, they're not the highest. So how are we going to, what are we doing to make Croydon a town that everyone can find an affordable place to live, where actually there's some money in their pocket at the end of the week, and that, you know, they're not, you know, at risk of their financial livelihood being threatened by these multinational companies?
So I think a key part of that, which you touched on, has got to be housing, both the provision of affordable housing locally, certainly for many people in the short term, the private rented sector is the only other viable option, and that's why we introduced the landlord licensing scheme there to hopefully play a part in improving standards there. We have now got a mayor in City Hall that's made the provision of affordable housing across London, you know, one of his top priorities, because whatever Croydon's doing, we can't solve London's housing crisis on our own or with one or two other boroughs. So a London-wide solution to a London-wide housing crisis, as that's the main cost for many households, has to be a key part of that. Then I think in terms of the other piece, obviously jobs, but not jobs at any price, which is why we started with the London Living Wage. But it's now why Councillor Watson and Councillor Aldsley were very much, I think, out this weekend promoting what we're doing next with our Good Employer Charter, which is it's not just, you know, London Living Wage is the starting point, but it's about terms and conditions, maternity leave, holiday leave, how staff are treated, and hopefully taking the London Living Wage as a starting point, not an end point, that we want to see Croydon having more than its fair share of high-quality jobs that pay well, so people can afford to both work here, live here, and spend some money that they will have left over in Croydon. And as even the current Prime Minister has identified, there's too many people in the country who are just about getting by. I think the sort of globalisation agenda has driven down costs, but driven down wages in some places. You've seen, perhaps part of that in the Brexit vote, with people feeling frustrated from a sort of society where they viewed things being done to them rather than with them. And hopefully what we're doing as a council is working as closely as we can with local people and putting local people at the heart of what we're doing in terms of sharing in the growth and investment into Croydon. But we can't do that on our own. As I said, we're starting that journey to some degree, and so it has been a welcome change in terms of the priorities at City Hall, but we need to see that delivered in the months and years ahead from City Hall, as well as town halls like Croydon.
Okay, so one of the fears that many of the people on lower income would say in Croydon is that they may get priced out by gentrification. People want to see their high streets and their housing stock improved and the public realm. What is Croydon going to do different than some other boroughs who've been severely criticised for ignoring the residents who have lived there for many decades?
Well, I think, as I've already said, by hopefully sending a very clear message that that's not what we intend to do, but although it brings other controversies, as we heard earlier with it, by the council having such a high-profile partnership with Brick by Brick, so actually getting back involved as a council in the building of affordable homes right across Croydon. The work, as I said, around the private landlords licensing scheme to improve standards there. And I think it is about making sure that whether it's huge companies like Westfield or local companies coming into district centres, that through the council's job brokerage scheme and others, that we are maximising the opportunity for local people of whatever age to get those jobs that are coming into the town. And again, you know, to do all we can, and we can only do so much to influence the local market to ensure those jobs are at least paying the London living wage as a starting point. And get people but believing that the investment is going to benefit them. And you know, I think we're making some progress, but it is a huge challenge. But I suppose because the growth has come to Croydon after it has already touched some other areas of London, we can learn by what other areas of perhaps could have done in terms of how they went about things going back a few years.
We heard earlier that there's a perception of this north-south divide, and as a councillor for the centre, I always find it very difficult to work out whether I'm in the north or the south. But if we just take that analogy that there is some sort of north-south divide and that the Labour administration is favouring the north, can you explain why you're spending so much money on social care? I mean, 25% of the residents of Coulsdon are over 65 and less than 10% of Broad Green. So why the hell are we spending money on the elderly in Coulsdon and not spending it elsewhere? Because it just seems to me that if there is a north-south divide and Labour Party is discriminating against certain parts of the borough, why are we spending money on social care when it's not an issue in many of the Labour wards?
So I think we made hopefully very clear, and I do welcome the question, that the funding, the proper funding of adult social care is an absolute priority for this council, and we will do all we can to deliver that. There is a national crisis, but we need to respond locally as well. You know, we committed last year to implementing the government's national care precept. I was shocked, frankly, at the time that the opposition abstained on that, because there could be no clearer policy than that money going to support elderly residents across the borough, and many of them do live in the south. Croydon has 140 care homes, more than any other borough in London, and I think it's something as a society we should all take as a key responsibility. And I think the point you're making in the question, Chair, is absolutely valid. There is no, 70% of this council's funding is through adult social care and children's services. It dwarfs, frankly, any other funding area, and it is this Labour administration that's not just spoken the language, but we've actually voted to, within the limited powers we've had, to make sure that we do fund adult social care properly. And I think the north-south thing is historic, I suppose, because of the electoral map of the borough, if you like. But Croydon Central, which I live in as well, isn't in the north or south, and I hope we can see that that sort of north-south divide change. I mean, Shirley, whatever the issues have been there, Shirley's not in the south of the borough. There are issues across the borough, and the funding of adult social care, huge issue. But again, it's this Labour administration that's ensuring Purley has a car park fit for the next 10 to 15 years, along with a swimming pool, and perhaps we don't shout about that enough. I mean, I perhaps should have put those in, as I said, in the slides earlier. Because I think it makes politicians of perhaps all sides lazy, and I'm very much a firm believer in one Croydon and one borough, and we're seeing that with the housing issues now, where people, wherever they live in Croydon, are going to currently struggle to get on the housing ladder unless we can provide more homes.
Just a couple of more quicker questions, and then I'll be finished. Do you think the new borough commander will improve police services in the borough?
Well, I think he's had a very strong start indeed. I can see Councillor Hamida Ali sitting over the back of the chamber there. I know she's been out on patrol, I think, at least once, if not twice, now. So he's certainly got a very hands-on approach, and he's, I think, on the record as saying he welcomes this administration's policy commitment to make Croydon a destination that people want to come to and spend their leisure time to, and as well as working here and living here. So I think if you look at the event we had a couple of weeks ago over at Croydon College, where we had the new borough commander, we had the Mayor of London and his new nighttime czar, I think there is a clear commitment to making sure that we all now embrace the rapidly changing evening and nighttime economy in the borough, as well as the very important traditional daytime economy that we've been talking about through much of this meeting. So I think he's very good news for this borough indeed, and I look forward to working with him closely in the weeks and months ahead.
And my final question is on Brexit. There are many risks involved in Brexit, but in regards our citizens, a significant number of Croydon citizens are from the European community. There are wards like mine where it runs into the thousands who are citizens. They pay their taxes, they pay their council tax, they voted in local elections, and they may vote in the next set of local elections. But potentially, that right to vote may get taken away from them, even though they pay their taxes and they pay their council tax and they contribute a lot. What message are we giving to people in terms of it's talked about elsewhere about inclusion, that we are going to strip away a fundamental right of a resident, which is to take part in elections and to cast a vote to see who's in charge of their local area. What is your view on the government or the country stripping away these people very basic local rights?
Well, to be quite blunt, I think the current government's position is shameful. I think the Prime Minister should rapidly, regardless of what negotiations take place, guarantee the citizenship of those EU residents already here. That's the right thing to do, and it's surely the right thing to do in terms of the situation that many UK residents overseas in Europe will find themselves in, and I think it's absolutely shocking the current government can't do that. I would echo the words of Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, in terms of London's position and Croydon's position. We recognise the contribution those citizens make to our town, to the running of many businesses, to the support and working in the NHS in this town. We welcome their commitment to this town, people working hard and paying their taxes in this town and supporting public and private services in this town. They're making a valuable contribution, and I hope we can see even this current government take a different attitude. I know many in the current government, many Conservative MPs are equally horrified that so many millions of people are being left in this appalling limbo in terms of their long-term future. And as you say, Chair, it is stripping away people's very, very basic rights, and it is a situation that surely cannot go on any longer. But in Croydon, we recognise and value the contribution that citizens from across Europe and elsewhere are making to ensuring, that as we sit here tonight, the hospital in Croydon is providing a service, that the offices are being cleaned, that the work that goes on across this borough that many people are doing from overseas and the contribution they're making is valued.
Thank you, Tony. We'll finish this item on the question time. It's just so I'd just like to thank you for answering those questions. I understand you're going to stay for the next item, which is on.
I'm certainly going to stay for some of it, Chair.
Yes.
Depending how far into the night you go, I may have to leave.
Right. Well, I'm sure if and the very first thing I'm going to say about item 7 is obviously. There will be some introductions around the table, but answering questions, the previous chief exec was noted for how long he took to answer questions. Joe, I know you're much more succinct, and I'm very grateful if everyone else carries on that new tradition of getting to the point reasonably quickly, because I have no hesitation in making everyone stay really late if we don't. So if you want to get out quicker, answer quicker. Okay, so who's going to be leading on this? But I suppose, Joe, do you want to go and do the introductions down the table regarding the proposed, or is Councillor Hall going to lead?
I'm leading, Chair. So, as you've correctly pointed out, I've got Joan Greeny, Richard Simpson and Lisa Taylor here, who I'll be doing the presentation, but in terms of questions, we'll be happy to answer any of the questions, and we'll all make efforts to be as brief as we can, depending obviously what the question is. So if we can move to the presentation, I don't know where the clicker's gone, but okay. So some of these slides you will have seen in various forms over the years, but I think it's important to remind ourselves the scale of the grant reduction that we're facing as a council. So since austerity began, based on the forecast, we've got 3/4 of our grant being lost, and in fact last year, this year and next year are the heaviest years within that. So, you know, when we say that things are tough and that there are big challenges, it's not sort of a gratuitous political statement, but it's the fact of what we're dealing with. In terms of funding per head, something on the colours has gone slightly awry, but hopefully you can see a purple bar towards the left-hand side. That's Croydon's funding per head at £329 per resident. All the red bars are outer London boroughs. The blue bars are inner London boroughs. The fact is that our demographics are such that they're more akin to inner London boroughs, and if we got even the funding that the lowest of those is, which is Wandsworth, we'd have some £25 million a year more to spend on services for the people of this borough, which just goes to emphasise the extent to which we've been put in a very, very difficult position when looking to deliver services for the residents of the borough. In terms of the funding split, the other thing that the effect of the grant reductions has is that, as you can see, not only is the overall pot that we have to spend on services going down in absolute terms and obviously in real terms a lot more, but the proportion that comes from council tax is set to rise from 43% just 2 years ago to some 65%. So, meaning that in terms of the support from outside that we're getting, and which, given the level of need in a number of areas, we should be getting, we're not seeing that, and we're much more, therefore, dependent on the council tax base and what we get from residents. Just a reminder of some of the main areas where savings have come in the last 2 years. And it's mainly going to be talking forward-looking about the budget, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that, you know, we have done massive change. So clearly, digital by design, looking a first look at all the contracts, the creating of the Octavo joint venture, agency contract savings, and much more that has delivered in our first year. Then, for the current year, again, we made some decisions which were considered to be, in some cases, quite controversial at the time, but which we felt were right in terms of being fair in how the council operated. That clearly included green garden waste, fairer parking charges, but also looking at how we use BWH and other office space better, improved contract management, looking at the redevelopment of Fairfield Halls and its revenue implications, and the increasing digital and reprocurement facilities management, to name but a few. So now I just want to, now moving forward, the challenge for the next 3 years. Well, the fact is that if we didn't take any actions because of the grant cuts, inflation and increased debt charges and demand pressures, we would have a gap of some 53 million. However, what I will go on to explain tonight is the areas where we see that potential gap created by the cuts in grant and other demand pressures will be filled. Clearly, there's the assumption, as we've put it previously in the medium-term financial strategy, of the use of the 2% social care precept for each of the next 3 years, and we'll see what happens on Thursday in terms of any changes to that. The base for council tax goes up as more properties are built, so that does have a benefit, albeit obviously also increasing the demand on services with a growing population. And so that means that when we're looking at budget options, there is some £36 million that we have had to seek to find over the next 3 years to provide the balanced budgets that we're always committed to delivering. So in terms of where we're forecasting to spend the money, before we go through the details, to emphasise the point being made by the leader earlier, you know, the bulk of our spend, some 70% of our spend, is in the people department, as you'd expect, and a lot of that is for relatively small proportion of the population in terms of that's not generally where the big universal services such as, you know, waste and grass cutting and other services and libraries and so on, those do not sit essentially within that figure, although some of them are, such as libraries. So, you know, the key thing is we've got a growth in the people department over the 3 years, even with all the initiatives that we're taking because of that increasing demand, although we're managing that, as I'll go on to in a little while. But what we're doing is forecasting that both the Place Department and Resources Department will show very substantial reductions over and above the significant reductions that have already been made in the net spend in those two departments, recognising that, you know, that the frontline services and the services for some of our most vulnerable in the borough are absolutely crucial. Just a word on the corporate items. A lot of those are very fixed, such as interest, such as Freedom Pass, such as pension deficit contribution. So there isn't a lot that you can do in those when looking at budget options. So 3 months ago, rather, I presented to Cabinet the efficiency strategy that we delivered as part of the 4-year settlement with central government, and so I won't dwell on this slide. It's just a reminder of the categories of initiative that efficiency strategy focused on. And I thought it might be useful, I know this slide's busy, but hopefully you've got it in front of you, of looking about, if we look at the 5-year period, so the two budgets that this administration has already passed and the 3-year budget options that we're looking at, about within those options under the efficiency strategy, where are we focused? Well, you'll see that the biggest one is about commissioning and contract management, that taking a commercial approach and managing demand are the other biggest items. And that's, I say also on managing demand, it's worth saying that the real figure is actually larger than that in terms of what's going to come from managing demand, because not only are there savings that we're showing here, but there's cost avoidance over and above this, which the various managing demand projects will deliver. So what comes out of this is a series of radical initiatives to do things really differently without in any way or in any case actually cutting any of the services. And obviously in questions I'm happy to go into the detail of those. In terms of the risks that we face, some of these will be the same as the ones that the leader presented earlier this evening in terms of the risks for the borough and the council as a whole. But in terms of finances, we've obviously got the uncertainty on how business rates retention will work, the changes to the formula of dedicated school grants, which risk leaving us as a council with a number of statutory duties and obligations without the associated funding. The impact on Brexit, including with the growth zone in terms of the implications for our income streams. The risk of welfare reform, it's worth remembering that in terms of what's going on just as we speak in terms of universal credit and benefits cap, that there are some 1,000 families who are going to be significantly impacted in the weeks to come, and very large numbers over the months and years to come, and the implication for the demand on services provided by the council, be it in terms of different types of support, advice, but also direct services, social care, temporary accommodation, so on, are huge. The overall demographic pressures that we've touched on in terms of an ageing population and a population where the level of need is going up, not least because people are being driven out, for example, of inner London because of accommodation costs. General demand growth that we're seeing, the uncertainty in terms of unaccompanied asylum seeker children, in terms of how that will be funded in future years, because although we, in the end, got the right settlement for the current year, that's still not finalised for future years. Clearly, we've got very challenging savings options, which will not be easy to deliver and which will have to be carefully managed. In terms of temporary accommodation, we know that we've got a huge pressure on housing, that this is the local authority with the biggest discrepancy between the local housing allowance and actual rents, and with the freezing of local housing allowance for the next 3 years and a booming borough, which means that rents are rising, that is only set to worsen. And in terms related to, at least in part, to business rates retention, the chance that we will, or the risk that we will find ourselves with additional responsibilities without commensurate additional funding, because government has talked about, as part of the 100% business rates retention, transferring a whole range of possible duties to local authorities, but it seems clear in that there would be individual local authorities that would be losers, and that is always a risk for us. And I will stop there. Hopefully that's been brief enough for you, Chair, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I will ask councillors to indicate who wants to go first. So, Joy, if you'd like, I've got you down first.
Thank you, Simon. My first question really is, I think, almost one of definition. I understand things like prevention being cheaper than, curing in the long run, that kind of thing. But managing demand, I'm having difficulty visualising what that is. You mentioned that it was a collection of projects, or that there were a collection of projects under that heading of management demand. So I'd be really grateful for a little exposition of what that is and where the savings come from. And then secondly, rather more specific, on your point about temporary accommodation, we obviously have lots of activity going on, brick by brick just being one sort of category, to improve the amount of housing in the borough. But that's a bit long term. It's not really, I don't think, a solution to the temporary accommodation problem. So could you perhaps tell me what we're doing in that regard, and possibly what off-the-wall ideas we might do? Thank you.
Okay, managing demand, a lot of that is about saying it links and overlaps actually with things like prevention and early intervention, and a number of the items that are in the appendix to the paper on the budget options. Managing demand could have easily been badged as prevention, because it is about what can you do by early intervention, by education, by behavioural science, to reduce the call on services. So, I mean, you know, in this it's behavioural change in terms of things like waste, so that you get recycling rates up and fly tipping down, and therefore have commensurate the consequent savings. It is in terms of helping intervene with families earlier, so that they don't need the same sorts of care packages and can retain independence. There's a whole swathe. So, but it is all the things that you can do that means that the and triaging, for example, as has been brought in recently in adult social care. There's all the things that you can do to prevent the need for services, or deal with demand and need in a more efficient way. In terms of temporary accommodation, you know, it is a huge risk. It's, you know, we've taken initiatives such as the leases on Concord, Sycamore and Windsor houses. We've done another, as last night in fact, a further investment in real lettings, so as to provide more accommodation. And there's a lot of the excellent work that the Gateway Services, which has actually reduced the number of homelessness applications that there have been. But the battle to find the supply of temporary and permanent accommodation for those in need is an ongoing one. And what I can say is that there's a number of options that we're looking at, including learning from what other boroughs have done, to see how can we go further and faster, whether that's things like how we can use things like Home Finder, where people wish to relocate to other parts of the country, or in terms of acquiring access to accommodation for periods of time. But it's an ongoing struggle. So you're right that it's a huge challenge for us, and it's definitely not going away.
Excellent. 2 minutes 51. I'm expecting the next response to be under 2 minutes, but also we need to be sharp with our questions as well. So it's a two-way street there, people. Who's next? Kath?
I have a number of relatively short questions, but I'll start with the priority ones, and I hopefully might get another bite of the cherry. So I want to start, I'll go through it sort of in page 1. So page 4 of the, I haven't got the pack numbers on this, but page 4, under demand pressure, in table 1, budget gap 2017-20, demand pressure growth, where the demand pressure goes additional 10 million, then 4.5 million, then 0.8. I think on that it would just be really useful to see what is the total sort of thinking around what the demand pressure and growth pressure would be without any action taken, so we can see just the total amount that you think you are going to reduce expenditure by the various actions. So I think it would be good to have that, to know, the size of the impact. Table 2, the efficiency programme, I noticed that on the integration of health and social care, you've got a significant amount in 15-16 and 16-17, but I'm assuming that that is the sort of the integration bit that is the first phase before the outcome-based commissioning, in which case I'm assuming that that sort of savings got delayed and won't really come in until 17-18. I've got a question about some of the figures. If we look at, we're now on page 13, and it's the detailed budgets bit. So there's a couple of questions about numbers. So under leisure services, we're spending 1 million, 1 million, and then 151,000. I'm wondering if there's a naught missing. And planning and regeneration, again, it's 3 million, over 3 million, about 3 million, about 3 million, then it's minus 384, and that's obviously a significant change. I want to know what's happening there. Couple of figures. I mean, I am interested that we're making a lot of our savings on resources department. So we've got a figure in. This is on the coloured bit at the end now. The resources department budget options. There's 30 staff. I don't know whether this is all resources or whether it's new operating model resources, 30 staff, and a saving of £1 million in 1920. And I'm wondering where you're expecting to make those savings. I notice again that for 18-19, there's 6 to go in finance and assets. We've already lost 12 in finance. I'm just wondering if there's anybody left. What's the size of the team at the moment where we're losing those 6? And what is the capacity really to continue to lose staff? I did ask this question the last time about how much capacity there was in back office services, and you did say it was limited, but we still seem to be going there. And I'm just worrying, about the sustainability of our services. If we lose, because back office staff do something, they're not sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So, and also one other question, and I'll leave it there, is just under children. Again, in their options, there's a saving there for children in need staffing, which seems to be another attempt to reduce agency staff. And I'm just wondering why that one might be successful. I mean, I know that about 4 years ago, there's a really big attempt to try and reduce the proportion of agency staff in children's social care, which, just doesn't seem to have delivered. And I think everybody has this problem. So what's the thinking there that this time it will succeed in bringing that level of saving? So I'll leave it there.
I'm interested in the answers. In terms of the integration of social care, in terms of outcome-based commissioning, that really is cost avoidance, because if it weren't for that, the demographic pressures would be huge. So it's not the case that that's a huge absolute saving. It's a cost avoidance in terms of future growth pressures. I take your point on demand growth, and the two overlap, because actually if we put that full demand growth, if you like, the do-nothing demand growth, if I can call it that, the figures will be much, much higher. I think the only issue there in terms is that would clearly be an estimate, because if people have the plans for cost avoidance, they know what those are and that they're overall, what they're comfortable with as an overall budget figure for their department or their sub-department. So we can do an estimate of that, but it wouldn't necessarily have the precision. In terms of the lines where the specific lines where you talked about on leisure, there is an assumption that the leisure reprocurement actually means that essentially that the current subsidy for the leisure centres that we have under the present arrangement with Fusion will be able to stop by having a totally different arrangement and using the assets in a much more efficient way, and, for example, having got a new pool and leisure centre in New Addington, which means that the costs will be a lot less and the income a lot more. In terms of the planning and regeneration line, that's the assumed first big dividend from brick by brick in terms of the development profit that will come from that. In terms of the reduction of staff and resources, there are some, just check the current staff numbers.
900.
There are some 900 staff. So if you look overall, we're talking about approximately 60 people coming out of that 900. So in terms of the ability to manage that, that's obviously something that we'll need to look at very carefully. But there are things like, for example, with the changes in the way that a number of the departments will work, with new ways of working, digitalisation, self-service and so on, the number of people you need physically to be turning the handle, shall we say, does get reduced. But it's also why you'll see that's in the later years, because it's recognising that with the amount of change that we've got going on at the moment, that you can't do those things overnight. In terms of the children in need reduction, then on that one, what, if you like, isn't detailed in these budget options is that we have assumed very significant growth in terms of rebasing the level of spend of children in need. So the start point is a lot higher, and in particular reflects some of the extra resource that we've put in this year in response to the joint inspection that took place a few months ago, which is also clearing backlog of cases, and therefore what we're assuming is that that extra temporary increase will not be needed on an ongoing basis. And hopefully I've answered all the points that you raised.
I want to come back to the first point about sort of the overall potential demand being an estimate. I think get the impression that all the figures are an estimate in terms of demand management, and that there might be projections, but they're not actual things like just you know if you're cutting staff, you know 5 staff go, they cost so much, that's it. The rest of it is projections. So I'm not quite sure why you can't project that, but you can project the other things. I mean, one of the things I do find slightly disconcerting about sort of outcome-based commissioning is that the last discussion we actually got at GPAC, the answer about most things was, well, those things are not determined. And it seems to me the only thing that is determined is how many savings we're going to be making, and that all the rest of it is, the answer was, that's still to be sorted out, that's still to be sorted out. So it's just sort of a bit of a concern that we've got a lot of, there's an awful lot riding on those figures. I think it would be really useful to see. You must have some thoughts if you're about what the do-nothing situation would be, and I think it would be quite good to know what the do-nothing figures are and the amount that we are expecting to either cost avoid or, in terms of mention, what those figures look like, because I think that gives us a better idea about just how much we're expecting to deliver through some of those aspects. So some numbers would be gratefully received.
Happy to provide those as we refine the budget options. And I think on outcome-based commissioning, there was a paper that went to Cabinet last night, and what that showed, for example, and I'm going to leap beyond this period, but that in 10 years' time, the do-nothing option would see the spend on older people rise from 41 million to 76 million, whereas with OBC and the different ways of working and prevention and so on and so forth, it's forecast that the cost envelope in the detailed financial model that's being worked up would lead to the council spending some 47 million. So if you want the scale, I know that's over a 10-year period, but if you want the sort of the scale of difference, but on a number of areas we can, but as I say, I'm just putting the caveat on those numbers that that work where it's been cost avoidance, we won't necessarily have quite the same detailed models and so on as we do in other areas, but I take the point.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. Only 2 questions from me on this, which are quite related. The first one is around potential impact of delays on the kind of financial projections. So again, coming back to the thought of Westfield, just wondering what impact that might have on finances with regards to things like business rates, infrastructure and costings, if that's been thought about within the budget. And the second question, the historian in me has already been a bit appalled at the rewriting of history regarding Fairfield, regarding Purley Port earlier. The project manager within me is intrigued how all 88 budget options are not ragged a single one red. In my experience, that is a very rare thing indeed. So I don't know if this has been a clean-up to make sure that there is no red ragging whatsoever, but are we 100% confident that all 88, so this is on pages 23 through to 27, all 88 of these department budget options are ragged either green or amber? Because that just seems quite ambitious to me. I hope that's the case. But again, relating to the first question, if these are delayed, what impact would that have on all of our budgeting and projections? Because I would imagine that at least one out of the 88 is probably going to hit red at one stage or another. Thank you.
I mean, in terms of the ragging, there are other options, but where they're classed as red, so they're not included, because where we think the risks are at that level, we don't include them in the budget options when drawing up the budget. So to reassure you, I guess, on that, is that there are red ones, but we're not counting those. So there are other things that might be looking at doing in terms of service improvements, in terms of delivering services differently, but where they're considered to have that level of risk, they're not included. So hopefully that answers that one. I don't think in terms of Fairfield and Purley there has been any rewriting of history. We've been very clear what we're doing on Fairfield, what we're doing on Purley. I think we've been consistent on that and delivering on those. In terms of the delays, I mean, the simple answer is if individual items don't get delivered at all, then you don't have that particular saving. What we try to do, and what we're, for example, doing this year, given some of the very high levels of demand pressure, for example, that we've seen, and some delays in delivering projects, is what are the other things that you can do to manage the bottom line impact of that. So that's the sort of the approach, to always look at what are the other things that we can do, other things that we can maybe accelerate, for example, that would help that delivery. And if I can let Richard also come in on this one.
Just on Westfield, so the direct financial impact of a delay in Westfield is more on the growth zone proposal than our general fund budget. So there are safeguards put into when we would take out the debt based on when we had more certainty about the Westfield development happening, which provides the biggest part of the income to pay back the debt on the growth zone. And just to cover the red, amber, green status, I'm probably 100% certain that some of those will be red during the year, some of them won't be delivered, and other things will have to be delivered. At this stage, preparing for next year, we believe all of those are deliverable, and all of those have Cabinet member sign-off on them, and therefore they're not rated red. As Councillor Hall said, if options were rated red, they wouldn't get into this report.
And I think it's worth, and I don't know if you want Chief Executive to come in on this one, just on status growth zone, but the paper we took to Cabinet on the growth zone a couple of months ago showed that there was quite a significant margin on that in terms of things slipping, in terms of the repayment of the debt that we're taking out to deliver the growth zone infrastructure. So it would, as Richard said, be timing, because we built in quite a significant margin into that. But if I can just briefly on this one, because it's so fundamental to the future direction, if I can bring in Joe.
Yeah, just to make a point about the growth zone funding, really. We don't have the growth zone funding until Westfield are confirmed to proceed. So as Richard said, a key point is that there's no aggregation between growth zone funding and the Council's general fund. It's completely separate. It's for a separate purpose. It's for infrastructure. We pay the loan back with business rates from Westfield, uplift, and Stanhope Schroeder Ruskin Square site. But we don't press the button on it until we know it's going to happen, because we don't know what the size. We know that based on assumptions of both Westfield and Ruskin Square, we have a growth zone around the value of £320 million. Without Westfield, maybe a smaller one. So, at the moment, there is no, to be absolutely categorically clear, there's no read across from the growth zone programme of infrastructure and the Council's general fund position.
Thank you. It's great to hear about the ragging, and I hope that is the case. I guess I would just say, in the interest of openness and transparency, which I know Tony is a very keen proponent of, fan of, it would be good, I suppose, to be as open as we can in terms of why things are ragging in a certain way and what the particular risks are. Maybe I'm a stickler for detail, but in my field I tend to need to justify why something is ragging in a way. And with so many here, there's a lot of detail here, obviously, but it's very, well, it's almost high level that you've just got 88 and each one is just either red, amber or green, and all we can see is amber or green. And I guess from a comfort perspective in wanting to be able to fully scrutinising things and the decision making behind it, I think that level of detail would be useful going forward. That'd just be a suggestion.
I take that on board, and what we can certainly do in the immediate is say the types of criteria, the key criteria we use for determining whether something is red or amber or green. So the principles, that can be done quickly, and then I think, in terms of future going forward, maybe we can look at that.
I certainly concur. I think it's something that we may want to have in our recommendations or conclusions. I think that's an excellent point. Carol?
Thank you, Chair. I noticed from the line-by-line budget papers, there's 58.1, I think, staff or roles, posts looking to be lost. So I'm just really checking that that those job or posts being deleted from the system is going to be done in consultation with the trade unions. And I also wanted to check whether we still have a principle of no compulsory redundancies, and if we do, whether that, given the amount of staff we've lost already, whether that's still sustainable. I've got another question, but if you like, you can do that one first.
You can do both questions.
Okay, yeah. So we talked a bit about the risks of business rates retention, and obviously I appreciate that we're still waiting for more information from government on that. So I see that, we've made an assumption that that it'll be cost neutral, whatever we get. But I just wondered if, for instance, the problems with Southern, and I know it has been mentioned previously, impacted on, say, major employers coming to the borough, what would the impact be on our finances if that were to happen? I know it's a bit of a guesswork, but I think it is an important factor in what might affect us going forward.
Okay, so in terms of the trade union, as and when there are concrete proposals in different areas, yes, and where there's a restructure or whatever, clearly the trade unions will be fully involved, and also we take these budget options to CSPP, so the Corporate Staff Partnership Panel, so that they have advanced sight of the principles of it. So absolutely that dialogue. We are still seeking to avoid compulsory redundancies wherever possible, and as you know, we've done some major restructures over the last 2 years, and I think that at most there's been sort of a handful of compulsory redundancies. So, we've been successful, and we would intend to do that on an ongoing basis. And part of the reduction in key areas of reducing agency staff and so on is one of the ways, as we did with the big changes in terms of things like the contact centre, where, there was some 100 FTE reduction without, in Graham Cadle's various areas, without there being a single compulsory redundancy in the end. So, it can be done with careful management, reduction of agency staff, use of vacancies, and so on and so forth. In terms of business rates retention, if we were to lose major employers, this actually comes back to the mechanism for the growth zone, because the growth zone sets a base for the central part of the borough in terms of sort of the business rates, and then says that we can keep 100%, not the normal 30%, from all the properties in the centre. So if we were to lose some of those major employers, it would be more, and lose the consequent business rates, then it would be more that it would be the impact on that whole growth zone piece in the first instance, rather than on the directly on the general fund. But clearly, if there were massive economic downturn, then I guess it could, in theory, go beyond that. But I mean, I think we have to bear in mind that until the formula changes in 3 or 4 years' time, which is obviously beyond this period, we retain 30% of business rates. So so in a sense we bear 30% of the risk out with the growth zone. What we're talking about here is the risk that the formulae for when we move to 100% means that we have additional responsibilities with suitable funding. So it's largely beyond this period, but could impact what we need to do certainly in the third year.
Jason?
Thank you, Chair. Couple of quick questions. With regard to the children in need cases, at graph 3 at 5.3, the number of cases is shown as jumping from 720 to about 1,140 in a 6-month period. If this is linked to UASCs, then that might sort of explain it, but there's no sort of connection with that in any of the text, and it seems an absolutely enormous change. So I was wondering what the cause behind that was. And also, you list in your savings at the end savings in terms of agency staff with regard to a recruitment and retention strategy for social workers. This has been tried a number of times before by administrations of various different types, 2 different types, I suppose, Russ and Croydon, really. And bluntly, it's never worked. We've been left with the same problem continuously. It's something that comes back to audit on a regular basis. And I'm interested why you think this time we've got a plan that will work and what's different from what's been tried in the past.
Okay, so on the children in need, that comes back to the point I was making earlier about the need to deal with a number of cases that were affected in abeyance or which needed follow-up, which hadn't necessarily been identified, and this was coming out of the work on the from the joint inspection. So it was so again, we've had to staff that up, as I said earlier, to deal with those cases, to make sure that they're properly investigated, and then in many cases, once that's done, they can be closed because matters have been investigated. But in the short term, the number of cases that have emerged from that greater increased rigour has increased, but it is expected then to come back down. In terms of the recruitment and retention, you're right that both administrations have battled with this. I would say that the work that's going on at the moment under Barbara's direction has, and with the work that had already started by Pratima Solanki, has actually produced tangible results. One of the other things is, again, in terms of different model or operating model, in some cases, and this is part of the prevention and early intervention and gateway work, that there are cases where we can prevent the need, there being quite as great need for social workers to be involved in cases, because if you can provide signposting, advice, support, wraparound, welfare benefits, advice and so on, you can therefore reduce the need of involvement of social workers. So it's also meaning that the staff mix is likely to change as well.
Just briefly, thank you for the additional information with regard to the strategy for social workers. That sounds more deliverable than purely a recruitment and retention strategy, which I know we've struggled with in the past. Just for clarity with regard to the children in need, so is this more a question of sort of reclassification of known cases rather than any new need, if you see what I mean?
I think that there is an underlying increase in demand, so some of it is coming from that. In terms of, for example, back to things like welfare benefit reform and other things, putting more pressure on families, which means more children identified as potentially being in need, but a lot of that is about dealing with backlog of cases that have not necessarily been identified or where things have come through. What we've also seen is that some partner agencies have become more inclined to pass cases through which might not have met thresholds previously, and we're needing to deal with that. And I think Joe wants to come in on that specific one.
Can I just say that Barbara's undertaking 5 different reviews at the moment across both children and adults to look at this whole issue of the weaknesses that were identified in the JTAI, but the amount of money we're spending effectively on the front door across the whole of children's and adult services. So the leader mentioned the TRASC program, which is looking at transforming adult and social care. There's a particular project that's come through recently, which is specifically to look at how we work with people on the front door of our adult services. And we're carrying out several reviews based on what we've learnt from the good practice coming out of that TRASC project in children's as well. What we're hoping to do is to have an improvement plan across the whole of children's and adults in the new year, which will be reported, which will outline, if you like, the outcomes of the reviews that we've had a look at across everything from the moment we have an initial interaction both with an adult and a young person and a child all the way through the whole time they're in our care, and we're responsible for them. And we'll be reporting back to a future cabinet in terms of the findings of that review, but also the improvements we're putting in that will deliver better results for people, but also hopefully have an impact on the amount of money that we're spending, particularly in those kind of front door areas. I mean, Simon's right. I mean, the key issue historically has been about the amount of money that's been spent on qualified social workers to do a lot of triage work. So the TRASC program is very much about taking social workers out of that kind of front door assessment and using our gateway services as a mechanism to do that initial assessment rather than expensive social workers. We are, though, just one last point on it, really. I mean, it is a real issue for us, though, because we are surrounded by local authorities that have failing children's services, has historically, and what that means is a lot of staff, they're paying a lot of money over the odds for qualified staff. So there's still a kind of quite a volatile environment that we're working within. But I think also that the kind of rigour that Barbara's bringing to looking at both sides of adults and children's will hopefully give you some comfort moving forward in terms of the budget position as well.
Kathy, you've got a follow-up question, I believe, or some...
There's a couple of other lines that I wanted a bit of detail on. Okay, so one is, I'm back to the yellow and green bits. People department. There's a line in adults that says income from partners, funding to be raised via negotiations with partners, and there's 1.2 million to be raised from that, so I'm just wondering what that is. And then there's a few, they're relatively tiddly bits, I have to say, down in terms of universal services, but I think they just, be as you know what they are, how they're going to be managed. So one is charging for exclusions, so who gets charged and how much. Charging for admissions appeals, I'm assuming that's charging parents who are coming for admissions appeals. And charging for academisation, I'm assuming that's charging schools somehow that are having to academise. Could just do with a bit more on those.
So in terms of the partners, that's largely from the CCG in terms of things like continuing healthcare cases and a constant review of those, not just our CCG, I might add, but being a lot more robust in terms of that sort of charging, but also making sure that, for example, where we've got pooled budgets, we're only bearing our proper share of it and so on and so forth. So it's that sort of piece. In terms of the three that you've mentioned on education, effectively it's actually aligning us with a lot of other local authorities in terms of what we charge. And you're right, for example, on the academisation, that is about charging the sponsor for costs that can legitimately be recharged.
In terms of appeals, charging parents and how much is it? And exclusions, charging who and how much?
I don't. But on both of those, it's charging the individual schools for the work the council does in relation to those. I don't know how much. I can get you a note from the director on exactly what the charging schedule is.
So it's definitely not charging parents for appeals?
It's definitely not charging the parents.
Excellent. Jan?
Thank you very much, Chairman. The first point I wanted to raise was the announcement today about the tax and things with council tax and things, and I just wondered if you'd had time to sort of think how it might, any effects it might bring here, you know, what your thoughts are on it, and etc. Especially as we do have such a huge deficit, really, in the people department and social care and everything else. So that's one area. The second one was at GPAC last week. It was raised, as it has been this evening as well, about the inner and outer London and budgeting and everything else. But I think you said that even when it's all the reviews gone and been fully carried out, because it would be all throughout the country, I may not be understanding this correctly, but please clarify it for me if I am wrong, but that we might well not actually gain from it anyway in the end. So I think that was the sort of point that was made. But if you could just clarify that a little bit more. And then the third point I'd got, what was it? Oh yes, on the staffing numbers. I just wondered if you would give me the staffing numbers of staff that have left the council, what the figures are now, how many we have employed, and how many have gone in the last 2.5 years. Because I know that the leader said about not wanting to outsource like some other boroughs had done, because we wanted to keep our own staff as much as possible. And that was actually also our policy. We very much wanted that when we were in control. I remember it very much going through, the committees that we had, keeping the staff as much as possible. And so I'd just like to have a few figures on that, if you have them, please, or otherwise could they be supplied? Thank you.
So on the announcement, as I think I said in my presentation, we haven't got an announcement. We've got all sorts of speculation about what might be an announcement on Thursday in terms of adult social care and some sort of thing where you can temporarily increase council tax, is the way it's been termed, but I think it's to do with the implementation of adult social care precept. The answer is, until we've seen what's actually announced on Thursday, really can't comment on that. But we will endeavour, we've been discussing this today, in terms of getting something out, if at all possible, before the weekend, in terms of what we think it means to Croydon and how that might affect the assumptions in our medium-term financial strategy that we've made up to now. In terms of what came up at GPAC, that was specifically about dedicated schools grant. To be clear, for those that weren't at GPAC last week, and that's about the change to formula. And although there is a rebalancing under the new dedicated schools grant, it still shows that urban areas, and that's inner and outer London, will be adversely affected by the new formula for schools funding, albeit local authorities like Croydon will be less affected than inner London. So the provisional calculations, when there were a set of proposals about a year ago, was I think that Croydon funding per pupil would go down about 6% from memory, whereas some inner London boroughs were facing, I think, 15% reduction. So it's less, but it's still a reduction. And the other point that I think I made at GPAC, but if not, I'll make it here, is that one of the things that the change to DSG also means is that the high needs part of the funding, which is where we fund the needs for those with special needs, will be a set amount, whereas at the moment we negotiate with the Schools Forum to get effectively to top slice the general schools funding, because our needs are much higher than that, if you like, standard formula would give, and that's true of all London boroughs actually, that they end up doing that with their Schools Forum. That flexibility is set to go, and that could have an implication, and again, until we know the detailed proposals, we haven't put anything, but it is a risk in the budget, because that extra spend might fall to the general fund if we lose that flexibility. In terms of the staffing, I don't have detailed staffing numbers year by year, but I'll get those to you and to the committee. What I would say is I have to disagree with you, actually, that was the previous administration's policy, because I sat on the committee that you chaired, Corporate Services, where time after time we saw the transfer of staff from the council to other partners, to outsourced partners, whereas what we have seen, be it on SEN transport, be it on the bailiff service, be it on a number of other areas, and what we're talking about in terms of some of the areas here is we have actually been doing net insourcing of staff. So I think there is using the make or buy approach. Facilities management was one where significant numbers transferred back in or transferred into the council. We have seen a net insource during this administration, whereas year by year under the previous administration there was net outsourcing. But in terms of the overall staffing numbers year by year, happy to supply those and also details of those net insourcing numbers.
I think we'll have to disagree on that last point you made, but thank you very much for your answers, and I very much look forward to seeing those figures.
Okay, just a few questions. Starting at page 23. Just interested to know what the street light energy savings, what's that made out of? Says £400,000 next year. Generating additional trade waste income. There's £200,000 saving, increase in income, I imagine. But when the South West London Partnership new procurement kicks in, I thought I read in the paper that they're going to be managing our commercial waste. So isn't there going to be some savings down the line, or is that kicking in next year? So I was hoping that we'd see some more income coming in from trade waste. Looking page 26, it's a bit of a bugbear of mine about ICT. As I said, I think we've wasted millions of pounds over the years on consolidating our IT contracts, and I'm still looking forward to seeing the benefits. That wouldn't have just happened by just going down and buying decent kit in the first place. So on page 26, if on previous committees we've heard directors explaining that their frontline services still don't, equipment still doesn't connect to the back office in any meaningful sense. So I note here that Graham is hoping for some savings because we're going to have less staff numbers. So that has implications for less licensing costs. But is there an actual recognised programme whereby we actually integrate the technology that the frontline members of staff are using? Because this was promised, as I said, 10, 12 years ago, and we don't seem to be anywhere closer. Looking at the very bottom of page 26, review of all Tier 2 contracts to identify options for savings. I'd just be interested to know which are the Tier 2 contracts. I've sort of got a rough idea, but it doesn't really give the information there. Finally, on this section, page 27, redesign of the mayoral transport service. Are we going to be giving them a bus pass?
Right. Trying to take those. I'll do them in order. On street lighting, that simply reduced energy costs by the fact that the new street lighting, now that it's complete, consumes less energy, and renegotiating those energy contracts. In terms of the trade waste, you're right. That's the net additional income from having now people who are actively marketing trade waste services, which wasn't the case previously. And obviously, in 2 years' time, we've got the new structure, and as a separate line, which in terms of that re-procurement, there's a £4 million saving when that comes in. In terms of ICT, I don't pretend that the council is perfect, but I actually have to disagree with you about the fact that frontline staff, such as, for example, our excellent NSOs, services officers and enforcement officers, now actually do link in much more automated to the back office systems. And we're looking at, for example, with Veolia, a system where the pass-through of flight tip reports and so on is essentially now automated, which wasn't the case. What isn't quite in place there and is being actively worked on as we speak is to make sure that the report backs happen in an automated way, so there's a faster response to members of the public. In terms of, it shouldn't have read Tier 2 contracts, it's Tier 1 contracts, apologies for that typo. So those are all the major contracts in the council, and it's going through those. There's a review carrying on at the moment of those contracts with some external support in terms of making sure we've got the contract management of those contracts right, and between that and looking about commissioning, including where there might be individual service lines that we terminate and do a different way on particular contracts if they're not performing. We're looking to do that over a period, sort of a lot of preparatory work's going on at the moment, a lot of analysis is going on at the moment, so that we can hit that next year. And, you know, that's consistent with things like our track record on imposing penalties and getting changes, such as we've done with Veolia, some £500,000 of penalties which had never been seen before, but also where there are some contracts or service lines of contracts that we've terminated for non-performance and found another route to acquire that, to provide a better service at reduced cost. So hopefully that answers those questions. Sorry, on the mayor's, no, it's not introducing, as tempting as it might be, a bus pass or a bicycle, sorry, Kathy, for the mayor. But it is looking at the type of vehicle and, for example, whether an electric or hybrid vehicle could be used to provide sort of as good a service to the mayor and the mayoralty, but at lower cost.
Well, that's an interesting point that you just made there, because obviously both the Mayor and our probably forthcoming strategy for the Council in terms of clean air, will we be pushing for vehicles that are not going to contribute to people dying, particularly in winter time with bad air quality? Existing?
It's certainly something that, if we're not already looking at it, you know, we certainly will. I mean, things like using the zip cars rather than people using their own vehicles means that there's, you know, less vehicle usage, for example, which obviously helps in terms of the environment. But I think you're right. We've got to look always at environmental aspects when we're re-procuring as part of that overall social value.
And
allowed to join in?
Yes, it's actually really, you've got overall responsibility for
Excellent. Because I know the Mayor of London's made air quality absolutely a priority, and we've seen why that's a very important decision in recent weeks, with what's been happening with, in London. So we're lobbying very hard indeed to make sure that Croydon's included at the heart of that strategy. But on a very practical level, as well as the longer-term stuff, it's making sure that we can maximise the amount of diesel-free buses that are operating in Croydon rapidly, and to be blunt, getting more than our fair share of that, and notwithstanding recent tragic events, to continue to lobby for, I think, serious expansion of the tram network across South London, because the evidence shows the huge usage of that, and there seems to be general consensus that one day it will be a major network across South London, and I think we all have a case to make, notwithstanding immediate funding pressures, to continue to make that case as well for sustainable transport for Croydon. So it is absolutely a key priority for this council, I think, and certainly now, we have a mayor in City Hall who's making it a London-wide priority, something we're determined to be a part of.
Well, as a committee, the Streets one is going to be concentrating on the clean air as one of its future committees, because it's such an important issue and so many people die every year. But within this, there's potential where we can take a positive step. Both the ID, Verdi and Quadron drive a lot of vehicles round. Veolia is going to be buying a whole load of new vehicles. Again, be very interested. We ourselves provide SEN transport. And also, potentially, we have the ability to send economic signals to people with diesel cars through our controlled parking policy. And we have done that in the past in terms of encouraging people to have zero emissions cars. Will we be able to, because effectively I'm putting notice to the Finance Department that will be one of the areas that I'm sure the Streets and Environment Committee will be asking is, it's no good the Council talking a good talk about air quality. We need to be seen to be acting as well.
Can I just come in on that first, Jay? Because I think you're absolutely onto something in how we use our procurement powers going forward, and we've started to see that with things like we were talking about earlier, the London living wage. So I think that is right, and I think the Mayor of London, in terms of cars or lorries of a certain age or emitting pollution, be it diesel, probably diesel, or whatever, frankly, then with an appropriate period of notice to allow businesses to plan for their future fleets, which is what you're alluding to as well, then I think we have to see that change. And I would very much hope that working with the Mayor, that's something we can build into our work going forward, because I think we have to be shown to be walking the walk if we're going to be talking it.
And I think just on that, in terms of priorities for commissioning strategies and looking at the quality element, which is now 60% instead of the 40%, then it's environmental factors in terms of sustainability. We've already done it in terms of employment and London living wage and apprenticeships. Then this is something that we can develop in that model. And I'm sure that there'll be some excellent recommendations from Scrutiny in that regard.
Okay, I'm going to bring this item to a close. There's some points that have been made by people. I think we can take them up. I think the more general point that I would pick up from this is obviously, we are in the hands of the government. But I think, being on this committee for a number of years, I would say the People's Department budget is the one that gives me most concerns in terms of both the demand and the cost of the provision of services. And we do have a Carol's Department committee does health and social. Well, it is effectively in terms of overseeing Barbara's, obviously new director's work. But the Health and Social Care Committee is very overwhelmed currently with all the changes in the health service. Much of that some of it is affected by what goes on in social care. And so when we come to the work programme, I do think that it may be worth just have a couple of minutes of discussion about how we look at social care, not looking for an answer tonight, because I think it has both budgetary implications in terms of this, but also about how we look at a key part of the Council's responsibilities. But otherwise, can I just say thank you for all 5 of you for attending the whole length of the meeting. And also even Hannah in the background there, tweeting away assiduously and reporting things. I have to say it's very nice to see, or even to read, in some of the quieter moments of this meeting. And we've got a quick paper due on brick by brick, and then we just got the work programme. But I don't believe anyone needs to stay for that part of the agenda. So
thank you very much, Chair, indeed.
well, we're here. We've got the item 8, which is responses from the Cabinet on a brick by brick. So on page 13 of your report, we've got the responses back. The responses themselves are actually on page 15 of the report. The 3 recommendations was about consultation and letting councillors be updated. That more notice should be given was effectively the recommendation 2, and that there should be feedback both to councillors, particularly because we weren't getting it. It looks, if you read the recommendation, that they've all been agreed by the Cabinet member, and that this is something that will happen in future. So I'm just looking for any comments in particular on this. Kathy.
It doesn't say it will happen in the future. It says they've requested that brick by brick do it, and it's certainly. We have requested a meeting, and we're going to be having a meeting and get a proper update, but that's because we've requested it, and we've not had any voluntary... I mean, obviously you can find out what the responses are to the different projects by looking on the website, but proactive engagement from anybody to say this is where the schemes are up to certainly hasn't happened so far. So I'd like to know, not that they're going to ask brick by brick, but that they're going to ensure that brick by brick are going to do it.
I would suggest is that we just pass on those comments to Alison and to Colm, who's the director, and to ask him to write both to you directly and to copy us in, because all of us will have these events. Though I have to say, you know, yours may be slightly unique in terms of at the moment in terms of that scheme. Okay, so otherwise, Jan?
Could I just agree with you, actually, because the word request is not very strong, really. You want something a bit more forceful that really does say we definitely want, we definitely want this to happen.
So what we're looking for is that brick by brick make a formal response committing to do this, and they also show evidence that they have changed and are doing it. Because effectively that's what the council will request, that brick by brick commit to doing this. So I'm expecting brick by brick to do it. Yes. Well, you all are. Yeah. Okay. We're now just into. I think we all, in terms of both the leader and the budget, I think we've picked up some very good points. I think James had an excellent point, but there are a number of other ones. I'm sure we can just review them, and but I think personally, in terms of just coming forward into the work programme, I am very interested to do to see how this committee can do reviewing social care to give it a proper time and place, because I just think, and that's for children as much as for adults. What I would ask is that the chairs, when they next meet, have a short discussion, because potentially I think there is a review to take place outside a formal committee of health, just because of the workload issues, and that would then maybe potentially looking for someone to sort of lead on that sometime in the new year. But I would like to have that discussion both with officers and with Jan and with Carol, because I do think we need as a committee collectively to get on top of the issue. And it's such a big one, I don't think you can just do it in an hour. So there may be a piece of work, and I've got an idea of who could potentially could lead on it. But otherwise, in terms of the work programme, I'm just want to point out that there's potentially are some changes to the streets and environment work programme that's listed out here, and that's swapping round of meetings, and effectively the January meeting is being shunted to February. The February meeting's been shunted to March, and effectively the 31st January meeting will now be on clean air, just because the figures of the number of deaths in Croydon and
and the fact that there is an engagement going on both locally and with the council, that if we want to do some pre-decision scrutiny on Croydon's clean air strategy, we need to do it in January, because otherwise it will be too late to influence future cabinet papers in February or March. So it would mean that the question time with the cabinet member in January is now on the 28th of February. But I hope that is agreeable, because it is a way of us doing pre-decision scrutiny, and it's something that's been agreed in conversation with the cabinet member, so they've agreed to do that as well.
Could you just check that those dates stay the same, though?
The dates, the physical dates.
The physical dates stay the same.
Yeah, just transfer.
That's fine. Great, thank you.
Otherwise, we won't run through them. If anyone's got any other issues or not, I'm hopefully trying to close the meeting to a close. Agreed? Yes. Agreed. Meeting closed.